All right, everybody. All right, everybody. Welcome to Pulp Fiction Renaissance Podcast number 2. Maybe you didn't get that job that you wanted, or you found out that your woman was no good, or you recently lost a major land war in Asia. Well, if any of those things have got you down, you're in the right place at Pulp Fiction Renaissance with your hosts, Richard Barrett, who can't breathe, and James Lafond, who can't see. So maybe between his bum eye and my bum lungs, we can make a complete functioning Pulp Fiction writer and website. So welcome, everybody. James, it's good to have you on this podcast. Good to see you. I'm glad you're here.
Well, thanks for having me, Richard.
So today, we last shot a podcast in January for Pulp Fiction Renaissance. It was 3.5 hours long, and I just released it last week. And a lot of people really enjoyed it. They seemed to like to say what we had to say. In fact, I had one viewer from across the pond say, "That James Lafond chap is absolutely delightful." And so I said, well, you know what? That's not even his target audience. So if they think he's delightful, then I guess he must be doing okay. So James Lafond is feeling good enough to come back on a podcast, and I really appreciate him coming on here and us doing this. So some of the topics that we wanted to talk about, we brought on. I have been editing a book of James. It's a book of his that has been in the works for a very long time. The book is called The Sons of Aries History Project, and it is on the, for lack of a better word, the primordial origins of the Indo-European Western warrior experience. It's a very good book. And I've been editing it. It's a 600-page behemoth. This thing is huge. And what's very interesting in it is, as I was reading it, this idea of ancient conflicts between different warrior tribes in ancient Europe, way before Rome, way before Greece, way before anything recorded that we have evidence for. And it is this theme of the Aryan Indo-European warriors coming down and conquering the Anatolian farmer populations. Now you say, okay, well, what's that all about? Well, a lot of interesting things, because once I started researching this concept in your book, The Sons of Aries, and then doing further research on it to supplement your work in other historical venues, all of a sudden, I started seeing this historical theme pop up all over the place in fiction and in historical fiction and in history and places where I never really seen it before, but I was seeing it all over the place and couldn't unsee it. So I defer to the master of this historical topic, Mr. James Lafond himself. Tell us a little bit about this topic. What does it entail? Why is it important to us? And where and how do we see it in Pulp Fiction?
Well, if I'm the master of this topic, we're in big trouble, because I'm just wading through a mass of stuff and trying to learn about it. I finished arranging the text for Beasts of Aries, the sequel, in 10 sections, and the sections seem to run between 30 and 50 pages. I'll proofread them separately and then assemble them in one book, and then I'll send that to you also. The most interesting thing about the Aryan invasion of Europe, which was in myth, Europa is seen as a female figure, a female deity, was that it took a pastoral people that were Caucasian, and they, by stages, between 4000 and 2000 BC, they conquered Europe, and this entailed the conquest of not just the Anatolian farming people, but the descendants of the Cro-Magnon people that wiped out the Neanderthals and displaced them. And those people were represented, I think, by the Basques today. I think that's about it. And there had been 1,500 years before the Aryan advent in Europe, where there was a stagnant situation where you had the Anatolians were holding all the river valleys, and the Cro-Magnons were out in the forest, and there's evidence that they traded with each other, and there was long-term, low-intensity warfare, like a frontier situation that's like timeless. So the Anatolians, I believe, are represented today by the Sardinians, and that's about it. I think I saw an internet piece, I think it was on Twitter, that had pictures of women that would represent the Anatolian people. And I think the babe that played in the James Bond movie Casino Royale was one of the ones that they put up. So it looks like you have an essentially blonde race of people conquering the Cro-Magnon dark-haired people, and then the dark-haired and red-headed Anatolian people that were the farmers. And the big thing is, once you got the Aryans in control, they basically kill all the men. There's hardly any traces of the paternal Anatolians. It's maternal. So it looks like kind of what happened in the Canary Islands when the Spanish went in. They now had this food base that would unhitch them from the grassland. You know, the problem that the Huns and the Mongols ran into once they occupied the Hungarian plain is that's the last refueling facility for their horses. Then they've got to go into forest. At least they could go and raid farming, little feudal farming setups that were in the forest. But when it was all a primeval forest, the Aryans would have had a difficult time invading it without the agricultural surplus of their Anatolian slaves. So the European culture is this three-part thing that comes from these three different races.
Well, what was very interesting to me was that this topic used to be a pretty widespread topic in the 19th and 20th century. And in preparation for this podcast, I was reading this wonderful book here, A Means to Freedom, The Letters Between Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, 1930 to 1932. And before that, I was reading a book from 1916 by a fellow named Madison Grant called Passing of the Great Race. Now, this book was in an entire genre of archaeological studies. One was written in 1903 by William Z. Ripley, which is called The Races of Europe. In 1916, The Passing of the Great Race came out. Lothrop Stoddard, who was famous for writing his, I believe, 1919 book, Rising Tide of Color, also contributed to this study in his book, Racial Realities in Europe in 1921. There was a whole slew of people writing on this archaeological topic from all different sides of the political spectrum, who, including, one whose name is Hans F. Gunther, who later became associated with a particular German regime that really caused a lot of problems, and the other one being Gordon Childs, who also became associated with a particular Russian regime, which also caused a lot of problems. And what was very interesting in a lot of this literature is they are operating off of many of the same archaeological sites that are being excavated today. And if you look at the contemporary archaeological articles on this coming out of academia, they are very, very difficult to sort through. There's a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a lot of academic language unique to the discipline. You have to sort through, you have to translate through. It really takes a long time. It's like speaking a foreign language. But if you can kind of get somewhat of a handle on it, it does eventually pay off, because you start seeing that a lot of these things that these writers in the early 20th century were writing about based off of these archaeological sites, we see continuity in the archaeological discoveries today, which is very, very fascinating. What I found interesting is that from what I can tell, you've read a lot on this topic too. Tell me if I'm way off base. But a trick when reading old history and reading anything new in the humanities is you have to translate the new academic lingo to the old academic lingo. So in the old academic lingo, you're seeing a three-part division in these different groups that were making up primordial Europe. You see the Nordics, who, as far as I can understand, correspond to the Indo-Europeans or the Aryans, as we've discussed. They're your big, blonde, giant Vikings, who are the fighting men and the Faustian spirit and all that sort of thing. And then you have your Mediterraneans. And from what I can understand, the Mediterraneans are this Anatolian farmer element, where they look a lot like these Nordics, but they're a little smaller. They're not quite as muscled up. They're a lot darker in hair color and eye color, sometimes in skin. And of course, they have this more matriarchal, earthbound, feminine, tellurgic, moon-based snake cult versus this northern Aryan Nordic eagle, skybound, Solarian kind of cult. And then you have the Alpines, and the Alpines are your guys that, as far as I can understand, and there was an interesting book called Long Heads and Round Heads written by, I believe his name was Dr. William S. Sadler in 1918. He talked a lot about this, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's the Cro-Magnon and the, you just said their name, the cavemen who were the forebears of the Cro-Magnon.
The Neanderthals that they apparently eradicated and to a certain degree interbred with.
The Neanderthals, yes, and these guys represent the Alpine population. They're a little stockier, they're a little heavier, they have rounder skulls, and essentially that corresponds to, like I said, these Cro-Magnon, these Neanderthal. Now, this was what I could understand from my research. You've researched this particular topic a lot longer than I have. Tell me, am I way off? Am I close? And how do you navigate the differences in terminology between new academic finding and old history?
Okay, so the jargon that you're dealing with the new academics, that's a priestly dialect. That's when, with guys like Stoddard, Grant, you're of the free-minded person that saw themselves as a person in the world and would pursue an academic project. And one of our best historians of antiquity was Gibbon. And, he's a couple hundred years ago. And those people are simpler to read and easier to understand than the current academic priesthood that's been writing since World War II. So I no longer waste my time with any current work unless it's providing graphics for me, pictures from a museum, like Eric Klein, who's the expert on the Bronze Age collapse. I used his book. That's for the Bronze Age, because he has access to a lot of stuff that's still being dug up and translated that I don't. And then I had to sort through his various obfuscations, and he seemed to do as honest a job in his pursuit of the subject matter as a man in his position is permitted to do today. So finding somebody like Eric Klein, if you're interested in the Bronze Age collapse, go ahead and read his book on it. I think the title is 1177 BC or something. But I wrote 12,000 words sorting out all of his oversights and his distortions. So, and I've done that largely because I've read the primary sources that he's also read without dancing on the head of an academic pen, because he was referencing the Odyssey and the Iliad and very much of this. And he read it as an academic, and I read it as a layperson who actually had experience living with people, gang-based tribal people that you see in the Iliad. Now, as far as the really clean Nordic Alpine Mediterranean picture that these guys were painting before they had a lot of DNA evidence. They were right about the language, and all the archaeologists that came after them said that they were wrong, that the language had nothing to do, wasn't related to this distribution of people. But DNA research over the past 20 years has shown that language tracks with the DNA a lot closer than the archaeology does, because archaeology is just going through the trash heaps of, it might not be the death of a people. It might be the people who said, you know what, living in this city is not working anymore. Let's live like our ancestors and go somewhere else. So a lot of what was being claimed 100 years ago to be a pure indigenous European race mixing with the Nordics to get the Alpines and the Mediterraneans, a lot of that's going to be mixing with other Caucasian races out of the Middle East and North Africa, like the Semites and the Berbers. You see this a lot, and I'm not qualified to sort it out. I don't have all this information in front of me. What my contribution is attempting is to track the mythology, which was, and the ancient literature of the ancients. And somebody like Herodotus that is maligned today is a mere folklorist. And we have Thucydides is held up as his replacement by historians of the period. He was every bit as scientific as Thucydides. And so I ignore what modern academics say about you throw this out, take it with a grain of salt, and then you cleave to this. And what I do is I try to, by doing almost all of my reading now in primary sources, either for Plantation America or the ancient world, and reading the earliest translations I can of these works, I try to just get a sense for what people meant with the words that they wrote then, instead of the words that are now, the word meanings that are now intercalcated by the academic priesthood that's using all this jargon. So it's just an attempt to sort through a whole bunch of stuff that I'm not really qualified to understand in a whole sense. But I think I am qualified to understand it from a mythological, symbolic, a literary, and a heroic sense, not because I'm a heroic person, I'm not, but I've spent a lot of time with people who would, in ancient times, have been heroes. And I'm currently now doing yard work for an 85-year-old woman named Arla, who was once a professional ball player back in the 50s and the 60s. And she taught everybody in this valley in the Rocky Mountains. She taught all the men how to play ball, and she could strike them all out. And she's still out there in the yard lifting rocks with me. She refuses to sit on her porch and watch me. Her husband was a guy named Dutch, who was a real heroic figure, who was a rodeo cowboy. He had his own business, and he opened up a gas station. And when two city slickers came up from the coast in their car, and they were gassing up at his station and cussing in front of women and children, these were two men that were half his age, and they were as big as he was. He told them to stop, and when they declined to stop using foul language, he knocked them both out with his fists. Okay, so Arla, I'm getting a feminine view of what it was like to be with a hero that I didn't know. I was a young man when he passed away. So, and her son, one of her sons that was a friend of mine, recently passed away. So I'm doing as much work as I can for her since he's not around. His name was Tim. But before we get into the Pulp Fiction, I just wanted to tag that because the feminine view of the heroic masculine is what my favorite Pulp Fiction writer predominantly trafficked in. So when I see it in real people like Arla, then it strikes a chord, and it also strikes a chord in something like the Odyssey, which some people think was written by a woman and attributed to Homer. I think personally that it was written by Homer and not completed by him, and possibly completed by a female, possibly his daughter. there's a lot stronger feminine elements in the Odyssey. It fits better as a lesson for civilized people than the Iliad did. So that's the dichotomy in the European situation, where you have a race of men conquering and annihilating another race of men, and then marrying their wives and daughters, and the cultural compromise that entails. I think that's the history of the European race there.
But James, there's a lot you just packed in there into that short 5 minute space. You are full of surprises. You can never pin James Lafond down. What I think
unless
is,
you're grappling, then you have me.
and that's why James Lafond is a striker. That is why James Lafond is a striker. But usually in many of your books, the women are the villains in many of your writing, and then all of a sudden James Lafond's like, we're going to talk about the good women today. Oh, that just comes out of completely left field. That's a fantastic thing to hear. I think it's very amazing that you have this lady that is 85 years old and was a professional ball player and is lifting rocks outside at this age, doing yard work, and is married to a Pulp Fiction character, this rodeo cowboy, long before the advent of feminism whatsoever. And you'll probably notice this. I used to work with a lot of older folks, and I never understood the slur that has come out of the internet, and that slur is boomer. I never understood that because my grandparents are blue collar baby boomers, worked in a factory, watched Gunsmoke, they're pretty salt of the earth people. But as I got to interact with many different kinds of people from the baby boomer cohort in about a year and a half period, there are extreme differences. And one of the big differences I noticed that when you have, there's a socioeconomic difference. If you have blue collar baby boomers, they're the salt of the earth people that'll give you the shirt off your back. White collar ones, now you're starting to get into, I partied at Woodstock and then became an investment banker kind of territory. But, there's a lot of that. That's not a myth, I can tell you. And then, but another big dichotomy is this age range between the boomers, where today it is September 3rd, 2021. When you have boomers that were born, say, in the mid to late 50s that are now in their early to mid 60s, that's a completely generation than somebody that is in their mid to late 80s. We're talking, 85, 88, or even early 80s. My own grandparents, my grandpa was born in 1943 and my grandma was born in 1945. So they're in their late 70s. And there's a big difference there in just that 10-year age gap between being born in the 40s versus being born in the 50s. But these are people we're talking about born in the Depression in the case of this lady. And I got to meet a few of those people in that age bracket. And I mean, they really are from an absolute another planet that's completely untouched by the modern world. It's like meeting a tribe of Indians in the Amazon. It's really amazing.
The boomers, I think they go from 46 to 65. I think that's the standard, or 45 to 65. I'm a tail end boomer. I've been called a boomer faggot by people that listen to me on our podcast before. So I sometimes introduce myself as a boomer faggot. I just thought it was hilarious. But Gen X people tell me I'm an honorary Gen Xer, but I'm on the tail end of this generation, which was beneficial to me in seeing changes. I think the slur about the boomers, there's a misconception that this biggest American generation ruined everything, because people your age do not have half of the opportunities that people my age had, right? So, and people even my age that were born in the 60s didn't have the opportunities that people that were born in the late 40s and the 50s had. So it was Arla's generation, Arla and Dutch, the baseball playing woman who married a guy that was a real hero. the elites, the coastal elites of their generation, sold out this country with different policies. And at the very same time, Hollywood was reformatted to kind of, become more of a negative thing than a positive thing. And some of the best Westerns of the period were actually done in Italy, small budget spaghetti Westerns. So the boomers are, because so many of them are just weak and fat, and even the hardworking ones are just obsessed with manicuring a lawn that's been poisoned. And there's this virtual religion amongst most suburban people that you can't live where food is produced because you're supposed to be like, the Queen of England or something and have this sterile manicured facade all around you. I think that's been pinned on the boomers unfairly. And I've written articles about how the boomers are the worst generation in human history. And I think they are, just because they're the weakest, which makes them the first victims of the elites of the Depression era. The people that were super rich during the Depression and just got richer during the Depression, they used these people of extremely good and tough character that suffered through the Depression to transform the modern world, and then even victimize the process, even victimized their own children. And we don't have to get into the policies of that, but anybody that looks at this country culturally or economically, like some bean counter, you'll just see that this country has been gutted. The jobs have been sent offshore. It's essentially against the law to be heroic. One of the greatest crimes you could commit in this country is to defend your own life, family, and household. You're getting locked up if that happens. So this is, and now when I drove from Ocean City with my brother to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on my way west, I saw 3 billboards asking to support our heroic troops coming home. And this was before the fall of Afghanistan, okay? This was before that. So these are already billboards up about when these people come home, don't be too hard on them. All 3 of the maimed, legless, amputee veterans were all women. I would venture to say that most of the people that lost legs in Iraq and Afghanistan were not women. They were men. So you see this extreme slant. And now heroics is purely a victim experience. That's all it is. That's all it is. So I think that's why Pulp Fiction had a rebirth and a resurrection in the 1960s, when boys who were now told the most heroic thing they could be is a drug-using musician. In the 1960s, they started to rediscover the pretty much extinct art form of pulp fiction that was now taken out of old magazines, put out in paperback books. And I was one of the kids that found that. I picked up Mastermind of Mars, I think when I was 11 years old, when I was just really able to start reading because I was a late learner. And in a lot of ways, that saved me from my fate that had been preordained, that I was going to be sitting in a cubicle somewhere. And although it was bad for me economically, I decided I was going to work with my hands. And I think it enabled me to appreciate ancient literature from the point of view of the people that wrote it, because all of those people did physical things.
That's a great point. I'll make 3 points based off what you said. The first point, I've noticed amongst boomers and many good ones that I'm friends with that are hard workers or blue collars people, I really see there was an attempt by the elites, as you said, of the generation before the boomers. They wanted guys that were, and women too, they wanted men and women who were hard workers that would put their nose to the grindstone, but would not ask too many questions and were not very independent. So you see a phenomena of really, really hardworking boomers with broken down bodies, with ailments that are, chronic, but not unreversible. You can fix a lot of this stuff, but, they're just in this mentality of, well, I'm getting old, I'm breaking down, that's it. But then they're still very hard workers, and they have a much stronger work ethic. And with a broken down body, they'll get a lot more done than the average fit 22-year-old who has absolutely zero work ethic whatsoever. So, you have this perfect, from a societal control standpoint. Yeah, it's the greatest experiment ever. We got these hard workers that work themselves into the ground, and then they have no sense of independence. They're just replaceable parts. It's very, very sad. And I witnessed this phenomena time and time again. And it makes me sad for them. I don't like that. Number one. Number two, you bring up a great point about the depiction of homecoming veterans. You see these billboards all over the place. You'll see commercials, and whether it's men or women depicted, or whether it's, an extreme visible wound that's depicted, or it's just some kind of a PTSD kind of thing, the overarching sense is a sense of victimhood. And you see all these soldiers, and they look sad. Look at their body language, look at their eyes, look at their facial expressions in these pictures or these videos, and it's clear that there's not this sense of, wow, you know what, that really was terrible, but I'm here, and you know what, I made it, and all right, here we are. There's like you said, a victimhood that is celebrated, which I don't think is healthy for anybody. Compare that to the 1947 movie Best Years of Our Lives, which was an Academy Award winner, about these three soldiers that come back from World War II. I'm always interested because, well, hey, it's not a Richard Barrett podcast if we don't mention Vietnam at least once, right? I've always find it interesting when you read some kind of left-wing academic account that, well, before Vietnam, nobody had ever seen any wounded soldiers in a movie or TV. Well, this movie, Best Years of Our Lives, which was an Academy Award-winning movie, was about three guys. One of them has battle fatigue, or today we would call it PTSD. The other one doesn't have any hands and has to use hooks for hands. And the other one, I think the other one is in a wheelchair and doesn't have any legs. I'd have to check. But the story is about how they all overcome these different impediments and go on to build their lives happily and successful. And the guy with the hooks with the hands gets married, and the guy with the PTSD, goes and lives on for his buddies that didn't make it. And it's a positive, inspiring thing to a whole generation of guys coming back from Iwo Jima and D-Day and saying, you know what, this was rough. It's going to be okay. We're going to make it. That's a different animal when your society is telling you that versus this message that you're talking about today. And then a third point I wanted to tell you, I think you'll appreciate. I was in a bookstore recently, and there was a gentleman there who ran the bookstore. He's about your age, kind of looked like you, had a ponytail. I don't know if he was a fighter, but it was clear that he worked out. And I was buying some Pulp Fiction books. And this is kind of a weird thing when you see a young guy buying this stuff, I had this one by a guy named, I think it was Barry White, and it was a World War II Marine Pulp Fiction book. It was written in 1965. And I read through it. It was really good. I said, okay, I'll buy this. It's $1. And he says, I got to ask you, why are you buying this? And I said, well, it's because it's really good. I really love this stuff. He's like, wow. He said, I read all this guy's books through middle school. He was a World War II veteran, and his brothers had all fought in World War II. And that kind of became a departure for me to become friends with this guy. So every other time I go in his bookstore, and he's like, so, okay, this is kind of what you like. And I said, yeah, this is what I like. He's like, oh, well, I've got a whole Robert E. Howard and Edgar Rice Burroughs section. And I said, that's awesome. And he had some first edition Del Rey, late 1960s and early 1970s, Conan the Barbarians, for about $35 in the plastic. And I was looking at all these and I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is what a young James Lafond would have went into a drugstore and this is what he would have picked up, and this is what he would have been reading, that would have started the journey leading to this podcast where we are today. It was a really neat thing. If you weren't a hobo and didn't limit your material possessions to, whatever you could tie in a bandana on a stick, I was like, this would be the best gift for James Lafond. But I know his backpack is pretty well laden down. But you're 100% right. I think that, the 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 jokes about the boomers and their lawns and their houses and all this stuff, and they keep everything really orderly, and there's a religion out of grilling with a barbecue and all these things. I think these are very domesticated, merchant class expressions of an ancient Aryan warrior ethos that is Apollyon and is focused on order, which is a positive thing. I think it's been perverted in a very domesticated direction to the point where it's not even recognizable in its original form. But links to history you can never sever. They're always there. You can bury them, you can cover them up, you can forget them, but they're still there. And that's something I see. And when I see that, I say, well, there's links still there. Maybe there's hope for the future generation to rediscover the primordial essence of this idea of order, which is a very Indo-European and Aryan kind of thing, which has inspired a lot of heroics. And so I look at that, and I'm a glass is half full kind of guy. Sometimes a glass is like a quarter full or an eighth full, meaning that it's like, 3/4 empty or 7/8 empty. But that is something that I see that gives me a little bit of hope.
See, you brought up the grill. That's interesting. That's more than a generational thing. The grill, the lawn, not having a fruit tree, but having some terrible decorative pear tree that's going to split in the wind. That's a suburban thing. It's just that the boomers were they were the children of the first suburban, generation. So they were just the quintessential suburban people. But there's an interesting thing in what you said that you can tie back to recently, when I was having bad eye problems, my editor sent me a vast library on this external hard drive. There's hundreds of audiobooks on here, thousands of hours. And I listened to the Iliad and the Odyssey a few times. And particularly in the Odyssey, and this also is in Beowulf. I listened to Beowulf like 8 times during this period. When a guest comes, you don't walk in with your spear. You hand it to your host, and he sets it up for you, and then it's okay to come through the threshold. And in Aeschylus, Zeus is described as the god of hosts, not in a biblical sense where he's the god of armies, but he's the oath keeper, and he's the god of the host who determines. This is reverence for the sky god as the father and reaper of gods and men. So like the one truly eternal god in their mythos is him. The other gods they can be killed. So Aries, when he's wounded by Diomedes, and only Zeus can heal him. So the host, no matter how rich he is, serves the meat. He sacrifices the animal. He gives a portion to the deity, and he cooks the meat, and he serves it to his guest without fail. And this is done. It will be done in Beowulf, a male representative of the king. We'll do this, but it is the patriarch serves the meat, kills the meat, butchers it, cooks, and serves it. In every case, when alcohol, which is all domestic food, it's the alcohol, whether it's wine or beer or mead, It's something that requires domestication. It's an offshoot of agriculture. That is always served by women or slaves, as is bread. Bread is always served, almost always served by slaves that are also women, sometimes slave men. Uh, the uh, the queen of Herat in Beowulf, she serves the wine to the heroes that have come to fight the monster. Okay. Uh, but there'll be some variation in that. It might just be slave girls, slave boys, whatever. But so I think that one of the ways you sold suburban life to men who you told you're not allowed to defend your row home in the city, and you better move out, okay? Because either the criminals that we moved in are going to get you, or we're going to arrest you for defending yourself. You better move out to the suburbs if you want a home for your family there. I think it's subconscious, maybe it's blood memory or something, but this idea that he can at least grill some meat. I've noticed that when I live in the West with hunters, when I live with Bob, when I live with the colonel, the captain, all these guys that hunt, they all insist on cooking the meat. And not just that meat. They cook the store-bought. You know, the wife will do the vegetables and the casserole, but the man, he cooks the meat. You know, so I think the suburban grill is part of a cultural compromise that is sold to the kid that grew up reading comic books, that's got little advertisements about how you could defend yourself against a bully on the beach. You know,
yeah. Charles
I used to read some of them, and then you turn the page and you got the advertisement for all the army men with the diorama that you could buy to set up, you know, and I was interested in both of them. So I think that maybe that could be a segue to, we wanted to do one on race, and we also wanted to do one on physical fitness, you know, in whatever order you want. But I think the grill, I think the grill is a survival of, Telemachus, you know, having to serve butcher one of his cows and serve the meat to the suitors that are after his mother's hand while his father's still trying to find his way home from fighting somebody else's war. You know,
I think you're 100% right. And I think that's a great analysis of that. You know, a lot of people, we live in an age where deep historical knowledge is really a forgotten thing. So people like you and people like me become sought out by people to gain this historical knowledge. And I think the reason because of that is we see echoes of all these traditions in just this perfect example of the grill that I don't know, I get the sense that subconsciously we know there's mythological and cultural depth behind so many of these things in contemporary society that we see and that maybe we like, but we don't know why. And I think it's a great segue to teach people more about these ancient historical mythological patterns and say, well, okay, you know, you don't let anybody else touch the brisket on your grill. Well, let's take a look at this history. And you think, oh, wow, that's really neat. It's a great way to plug people into the heroic and epic past. You know, you talked about earlier Pulp Fiction novels being reissued in the 60s and 70s as an alternative to this idea of being just a drugged out musician. And if anything, the 1960s was a time, as I look at it as a historical period, where you had so many of these contending mythological patterns contending in the public sphere like Olympians and Titans. And maybe the population doesn't know what all of the mythological depth is behind this, but they know, like, my grandpa's a blue collar factory worker. Okay, he knows he's a John Wayne, Clint Eastwood guy. Okay, he doesn't watch Soul Train, he doesn't listen to the Beatles, he listens to Merle Haggard. So we have these cultural markers, right, that some of us will be familiar with, but they have a deep mythological depth. Obviously, I'm a big fan of John Wayne, and I've talked about this many times. I know he's not your favorite, but Clint Eastwood has also really come to grow on me in the last few months. I want to say that. I think you'll appreciate that. I watched Outlaw Josie Wales for the second time. I watched it 5 years ago, and then I watched it a couple months ago, and I connected with it a lot more the second time. I think it was the time of my life and the perspective that I was in. Maybe it's meeting a one-eyed hobo. I don't know. But without going down that rabbit trail, you see, in this idea of where you have a John Wayne figure, many postmodern literary criticisms of his work, and there's a whole cottage industry based off this work. They're obsessed with this guy that 9/10 of the population today doesn't even remember. They're obsessed with him, and it's this idea that he is this Zeus-like Aryan patriarchal war chief. And then you have, you can take any kind of hippy-dippy thing from the 60s, the Age of Aquarius, or any of these guys, and it's this idea of, it's a very Dionysian, what was Woodstock but a Dionysian orgy? And what it was, a Dionysian orgy but a Mother Gaia just fertility ritual, So you see these patterns contending, and they're there in our culture. But in my experience, I want to learn, where do these come from? They didn't just come out of thin air, right? Well, it was just the style back then, or it was just the fashion, or that was the 60s or the 70s. No. There's never just that was standalone. There's always more. You're looking at a tip of the iceberg. I want to see that 90% of the glacier that's underneath the water. That is the iceberg. And I think as the world becomes more adrift and unmoored, people are looking to see what that glacier is as well, which makes me happy because it makes me a little less isolated. People want to talk about topics I care about. So it's a win for me. I consider it a win.
I recently saw 3 John Wayne movies that I liked. Stagecoach, and he would struggle to try to play that character again. I think he did it kind of as Big Jake. Later in life, when he had control, he had a certain measure of control. Hondo, which was a Willie Moore novel that was adapted, where he's a half-breed. He's part Indian. And my favorite John Wayne movie I saw again, and it had Ron Howard in it. It's called The Shootist. I think it was his last movie. And the character was dying of cancer. And I think Jimmy Stewart was his doctor.
Yeah.
And that was, for realism, that was probably his best Western. So I think, when you look at that, when you look at The Shootist, I think you get to see what John Wayne wanted to depict, because it was his last movie. And then when you look at the body of his work will fluctuate. And even when he tries to do a correction of High Noon, he didn't like how unheroic High Noon was with the Gary Cooper movie, and he did Rio Bravo. He was still forced by Hollywood conventions to play a cucked father figure, a man that was not allowed to shoot the bad guy until after the bad guy shot him, a man who was not allowed to do the right thing until the little lady in the saloon says it's the right thing, so, and so I think Rio Bravo, if you look at the midpoint of his career there, that shows you the extreme struggle he was under to try to keep alive the type of heroic myth that he did in Stagecoach and Hondo before World War II, in this endless struggle against this toxic, cuckery, I don't know what to call it, this just civic religion of just letting the experts take care of everything, including self-defense. The police are going to come protect you. You don't have to protect yourself. So and then you see him finally, his Parthian shot against the whole Hollywood system. He does it in The Shootist, okay, where he finally gets to play the character that he wanted to play as an older guy. I think it would be, I think that would be the best way to look at Wayne. Wayne's largely, what I didn't like about his career was how he was largely forced to play characters that in a way that he would have rather not played them, because he was in the mainstream. Just like I listened to an interview with Victor Davis Hanson by a professor at a young college, and even though the subject was who killed Homer, based on one of Hanson's books, he wrote it with somebody else, and even though this was the subject, how did we let these brats in universities tell us what was right about human life and step away from everything that was taught to us for 10,000 years? Even though this man was doing what John Wayne did when he made Rio Bravo, just trying to bring out a voice that's going to go against something that's civic to the point, to the toxic point of view, where you're not going to do the right thing. He said every time he was going to say fighting man, he said, our women and men that go to war, our women and men that do this, our women and men that do that. Forgotten is the idea that you would just say a fighting man. That's beyond the pale, okay, which means we've got to put our daughters and wives that could be having children out there and have their legs blown off, okay? Forget that. That's not even on the table. This guy who's actually rebelling against the academic establishment, and he's on the ground floor of this new college for conservative liberal arts.
Hillsdale, yes.
This was okay. So Hanson's usually associated with Stanford and Hillsdale, but this is another even smaller college than Hillsdale, trying to do the same thing. This guy still has to say our women and men that fight war. Can't even say men and women. So this is where the jargon defeats us. This is where you start to, your values start to become the victim of your civics and your politeness, because the Achilles heel of the heroic figure or the warrior, and by a heroic figure, we could just say the guy, probably like most of your listeners, that would rather punch out the mugger than do what the police say, which is give them what you want and then call us, okay? I'm talking about heroic in a very basic human decency sense. That same guy is going to hold the door open for you, and he's going to be polite to you. So that's his Achilles heel. That's where you mug him. When he's holding the door open for you, that's when you invalidate him and try to get him beyond civil society by making him make this choice. Am I going to say fighting men and women, or am I going to say fighting women and men? And his civic sense of being polite is going to be used against his own values. And
it's the trap of, what we've talked about many times, the confrontational warrior. If the confrontational warrior only fights under a certain set of circumstances with a certain set of rules, with only a certain, boundaries being crossed, he's not going to play the knockout game, proverbially speaking. So he's going to be set up to become prey for these kind of mind games. This was something that when the ancient Romans wrote about dealing with the ancient Germanics, they're like, look, this is their Achilles heel. Exactly what you said. You're reading that in the Strategicon and a wide variety of other sources. And this is how we can take advantage of these people. So that is, everybody's got a weakness. You talk about the Shootist. The Shootist reminds me of you and Dr. Dredd a lot, because you have this old, broken down guy, right, who's a legend to a lot of people. And he seems to be on his last leg. And that's a theme in your writing that comes up, that's come up a lot in the last couple of years. Of course, I'd like to see you going strong for a long time, but you never know what might happen. And The Shooters is a great movie because he's like bringing together all of the, in my favorite book, Gunfighter Nation, Myth of the 20th Century by Richard Slotkin, which I'm always talking about. There's a quote in here that we talked about, and I put it in an article recently, but it's worth reading again. It says, quote, "A culture has its heritage of lore, which is preserved for use by designated lore masters, storytellers, or historians, and is transmitted by them to the public in one or more of the genres, oral or literary." And John Wayne was very conscious that he understood that he was the warrior lore master for up to at least two generations. He was very conscious of that in a Homeric sense. But as you said, unlike Homer, he didn't always get to make his own decisions. Go back to Rio Bravo. Who was cast in Rio Bravo alongside John Wayne? You had Dean Martin and Ricky Nelson. Now, do you know who was supposed to be cast in those two roles? Here's who was supposed to be cast. My two other favorite guys, Frank Sinatra, who was a psycho. If you ever read anything about Frank Sinatra, you want to talk about a guy that believed in this basic heroic sense. He would get into fist fights all the time and did not have a fighter's physique. He was very touchy about his honor and the whole 9 yards. I mean, he was nuts. You watch any Rat Pack, any of it from the Sands or wherever, and they're doing the shtick, and there's him, and there's Dean Martin, and there's Sammy Davis Jr. Okay, Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. are like making fun of themselves and laughing at each other and acting like idiots. And Frank Sinatra is just the angry straight guy in the bit who is insulting them. That's his attitude. So you were going to have him play Dean Martin's character. And then to play Ricky Nelson's character, you were going to have one of my other favorite guys, Rod Taylor. And Rod Taylor was a guy who was a tough blue-collar Australian guy. Talking with you and Rusty, I was because you guys both love Clint Eastwood, and I never really got into him as much. And I'm like, okay, why is that? Obviously, these guys are really into him. Why did I miss that boat? Well, for me, the work of Rod Taylor, who was very obscure, he's filled the void that Clint Eastwood fills for most people, who's a much more high-profile guy. Rod Taylor and John Wayne were best.
I think Skype froze, Richard.